Hi, everyone. Thanks for everybody who's here today. This panel is investing in the next generation of energy leaders. Yesterday we were hearing from senators, folks like Abby Ross Hopper, and Jigar Shah asking some interesting questions, and conversations about how to scale investment globally and ensuring the energy transformation, how that can be done equitably. So today, to close out, we're really looking forward. We're looking at the future of this industry by checking out some of the work by students here at Dartmouth, what they're doing and what's motivating them to think about and address these energy issues. I am Katie Tweed, and I, for a long time, was at Green Tech Media, and I now head up partnerships and content for the newly launched Canary Media. If you haven't had a chance to check out canarymedia.com. It was formed by a lot of folks who were longtime GTM journalists and some other folks behind the scenes. We are back, and we are hoping to be that same resource for not only clean energy insiders, but I think as these last couple of days have shown, that it's not just solar folks or energy storage geeks. Clean energy and climate tech solutions have to be found absolutely everywhere, right? In every single industry, in every corner of the globe, and they have to really work for everyone. And so that's what Canary is going to be covering. So if you haven't, again, checked us out yet, please come read some stuff and subscribe at canarymedia.com. Okay, well, I think that's enough about Canary. So, this is really about all of the students that we have here on this panel today that are going to walk you through some of the really cool work that's happening. The Irving Institute for Energy and Society launched just a few years ago. Its goal is to broaden, really turbocharge Dartmouth's leadership in energy education and research. So it's doing that, by providing seed funding for research, and of course, and also doing course development across a whole range of disciplines. And so you're going to see some of that here shortly when we jump in to what these students are doing. It's also sponsoring hands-on research. And so there was a lot to pick from. There's a lot of really good stuff happening in this. These were chosen to showcase some of the diversity of the projects from students. I wasn't involved in picking these selections, but one of the things I really loved is that these aren't just academic projects for the most part. Quite a few it's all about getting out in the real world, seeing how energy is working and what needs to change and what can evolve and how this is impacting society. So whether that's powering a tiny research station or better understanding the entire energy ecosystem, whether that's in the Gulf of Mexico or across RTOs, regional transmission organizations, we're going to hear about all sorts of awesome stuff. So if you have questions, we will hopefully answer all of them or most of them at the end, but feel free to put them in as you're listening to these presentations, and we will circle back if they're for somebody in particular. Absolutely, you can note that if you have questions that you'd like some different students to chime in on, that's great too. So to kick it off, I'm going to hand this off to Emma Doherty, and she's going to talk about her capstone project, which I already tipped off a little bit. So Emma, it is all yours.
Thanks, Katie. Let me share my screen here. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Emma. I'm a 21, so a senior, and I'm going to be talking about my capstone engineering project, which I did with these 5 other students listed here. They deserve a lot of credit. So the story of this project starts with the tiny house that you can see on the left of your screen. Professor Vicky May at Thayer got an experiential learning grant to start this project a couple years ago, and involved a number of different classes and students and faculty, and got it started, but then faced some challenges with permitting and COVID hit. So construction was stalled, and she decided to turn this into a capstone project. So we got this partially constructed mobile tiny house, and were tasked with designing and then constructing it. And the first step of figuring out how to design this was to determine the use. So the suggested use was for ecology researchers up in the Second College Grant in northern New Hampshire. They need extra research space apart from their current living space up there. And we thought this was a great use for the structure, but we realized through user interviews that they would only be using it for approximately 9 months out of the year. They didn't need it in the winter. So we looked around and we asked ourselves, how could we maximize the value of this house for Dartmouth and find another use for it? And inspired partially by the grant that originally funded it, we realized that Dartmouth and Thayer have both really been pushing experiential learning in the past couple of years. And we also observed that students have really this increased interest in sustainable design. And so we took all of these different stakeholders' needs and decided that we would turn our station into a living lab. So a living lab is a space that's in active use, but is also really designed for experimentation and innovation and iteration. And we thought this would be the perfect way to sort of address all of the needs of these different groups. The idea is that the house will be up in the grant for most of the year for ecology researchers. And then in the winter months, we'll come back to Dartmouth and be a space where students can see sustainable design in action and also adapt the building, change it, experiment with it, and monitor the energy use and learn about the systems that it uses. So the next step after we determined the use was to actually design it, and we spent most of fall term doing this. You can see here our final design. It was really human powered as far as what we included. So the ecologists said they really wanted a lot of table space and natural light. And we were also guided by sustainable design concepts such as a super insulated, really tight envelope, healthy and sustainable natural materials. And additionally, to continue the learning past ourselves, we wanted it to be all monitored. It's completely off grid because of the constraints of the Second College Grant, and we're going to monitor the energy production as well as the use. Next stage after designing it was to actually go and get our hands dirty and construct. So this past winter, we spent many, many slightly chilly hours just south of Hanover building this house, and we got to go through almost the entire construction process from initial testing to framing windows and installing them. We had to move the door around, stuff insulation, and then added a lot of different membranes, built a double stud wall. Down in the right corner there, you can see that's the stage we were able to bring it to. Unfortunately, there were some complications in construction, so we weren't able to finish it, but there is a class that's currently working on this project, and it should be finished for the fall so that it can go up to the Second College Grant and be used by some ecologists this year. And we're really, really excited for that. But beyond that, we're excited because this is going to provide, our vision is for it to provide continued learning for many, many more Dartmouth students. So not only do we have this physical structure that is almost ready to use, it's adaptable, it can be experimented on and is monitored, but we also have a website where that monitored energy data will be housed for future use and incorporation into classrooms. And we documented our sustainable design process so that other students can be inspired and learn about this and hopefully apply it to their own projects, get creative, and contact Professor May if they want to try to experiment on the house. So we're really, really excited to see where this goes and hope that it will be a great resource for energy learning in the future. Thank you for listening. You can learn more about our project at our website, and I'm going to now pass it off to my peers, Jack and Pierce.
Alrighty, thanks so much, Emma. Let me share screen here real quick. Alrighty, well, thank you guys so much for allowing me and Pierce to talk about our experience on the Gulf Coast Energy Immersion trip that we took in December 2019 to Texas and Louisiana. Now, before I went on this trip, I had always thought of energy systems in these really kind of abstract academic terms. And the main takeaway that I had from my immersion trip was that these energy systems are so large and so vast, but they have so many lives and stories and faces and people behind them. And the first place that I noticed that in was Texas. On our day spent on the Texas oil fields, when we were looking at the workers on the Texas oil rigs. And, you know, I had such a conflict of emotions because on the one hand, I was seeing the hardworking, true nature of these American common working men and working women, you know, going for weeks on end on the oil rigs and, you know, putting in shift after shift to earn a living. At the same time, I recognize the vast damage that these systems are doing to the environmental systems of our nation, but also recognizing that it's my own consumption and the consumption of this nation that is causing that supply of energy to be needed. And so it was just this conflict of emotions and this incredible experience to think about both the humanity behind these energy systems and the environmental toll of them. We also saw incredible pain and suffering and stories of devastation from the BP oil spill in Louisiana. And you can see a picture of that to the right. And here, you know, the news stories of the BP oil spill transformed into the face of Sandy. Sandy was a community leader in one of the Louisiana fishing communities that we saw, and seeing her pain from the devastation that this oil spill had done put a face to all of these stories about energy systems and their potential consequences that was so plain to see. You know, her acute pain at seeing her neighbors suffer the consequences of this oil spill was just striking. And it definitely, you know, elaborated on this experience that I was having, that this was more than just a news story, more than just a headline, that these are people that are being affected by these things. Let me get to the next slide here. And beyond the human effect of these energy systems, there's always our precious natural resources as well. And my favorite part of the immersion trip was probably our boat ride through the Louisiana Bayou. And you can see on the right there that one of the things we saw in the bayou was old gas and oil pipelines from past energy projects. And I had such a simultaneously unnerving feeling of the fact that human development could reach so deep into our natural systems, but also this sense of beauty that nature would one day reclaim all of these things for its own domain, and that these natural systems will outlive us all. And ultimately, the conclusion that I came to, and the main takeaway, which I'll share now, is this. These energy systems that we know today have truly seen such rapid change and have only been a part of human history for such a short time, let alone Earth's history. And our current energy systems, oil and gas especially, at one time they were seen as so innovative and so exciting and so new. But now we're starting to recognize the damage that they can do to this planet. And it's my hope that we can enter this new energy frontier, these new energy systems that bring that same excitement, that bring that same innovation, things that are important also, though, like job security for the working men and women of this country, but bring it in a way that's cleaner and healthier and gives us an energy system that ultimately we can be proud of and that our generation can say that we did for the world. So thanks so much, and I'm going to pass it off to Pierce now.
Yeah, thank you, Jack, for everything you shared. I really, yeah, everything you said really resonates with me. I wanted to share a couple photos that I selected while we were there. The first one, oh, Jack, if you could change the slide. Oh yeah. So these photos are also from the Louisiana when we went on a boat ride on the bayou. So you can see all of us in the boat. And similarly, yeah, just thinking about the environmental impacts of oil and gas in the energy system. So this is an old abandoned, just like some abandoned infrastructure that was just in the bayou and had been like decaying for years. And similarly, it was just like really appalling for me to see how much was left behind and how much of an impact it was having on the wildlife and the animals and stuff. And yeah, if you could go to the next one again. And then these photos are from our boat ride with Sandy. So one of the things that I guess the whole theme of the trip was, so in the beginning, for the first about week and a half, we were in Texas and the Houston area looking at kind of like what the energy system and infrastructure actually looks like and that kind of industry. So like Jack said, talking to people who worked in energy, looking at the impacts in like surrounding communities. And then in Louisiana and in like the rest of the region, we kind of looked at the social and environmental impacts of energy. And I think our day spent with Sandy really showed the social impacts of energy. Just seeing how the BP oil spill affected like Vietnamese fishing communities, and especially on this day, we interacted with some indigenous communities who'd worked in oystering, and they actually let us. We actually got to try some oysters, which was really a really cool opportunity. They were like the biggest oysters I'd ever seen. But just thinking about how the BP oil spill and all these different energy things had kind of affected their livelihood. If you go to the next one. And then, yeah, so this is the day when we went to a fracking site. And similar to Jack, there was really a conflict between seeing people who worked so hard and depended on this for a living, and then also like, having learned in the classroom that, oh, fracking is bad. And like, even hearing like on our trip about, we would go and they would tell us like all the impacts of fracking. But then seeing, how hard people were working and how dependent people were on it. And also how I guess underinvested in our education system is, because especially in Houston, there were a lot of people who were saying like, yeah, like if I am a senior in high school, like I can get a scholarship from Exxon to do like 2 years of community college and then be making 6 figures my first year out of community college through this like Exxon scholarship program. And so if you're living, if you're living in not the best conditions, like that is pretty much the only option for some people. So just thinking about how these energy systems are a lot more complicated than just like fracking is bad and we need to get rid of it, or like we need to have more renewables. Next one would be. And then finally, these 2 pictures are from another one of our days in Louisiana, where we went on a bike ride with the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. And so the Louisiana Bucket Brigade is a group in Norco, Louisiana, which is a community that's been greatly affected by environmental racism. And there's a big shell processing plant that has been releasing toxic smoke and gas into their community for decades. So bad that when it rains, like people can't go outside sometimes, and they would get like bumps on their skin when they go outside. And so we just did a bike ride with some of the community organizers around the community, just seeing the effects of shell and how much it's taken over the community. And that was also really impactful because, as I said just a few days earlier, we'd been in Texas looking at like exactly how these companies run. So yeah, that was all I had, and I guess we'll now be passing it on to Elizabeth Sum.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. Great. So I'm Elizabeth. I am a second-year tax student, so pursuing my master's in business administration. Before TUC, I was in California working for a regulated utility named PG&E. And what I want to talk about today is energy and gender equality. And we'll start off by actually breaking down those components: energy, gender equality, and then gender and gender, mouthfuls, energy and gender equality together. So when you think of energy, you probably think of these pictures of renewable sources, sustainability, electricity. For me, when I was working in the utility space, it was just keeping the lights on. When you think of gender equality, you probably think of equal opportunities between men and women, both in the professional setting and perhaps in society. Norms, stereotypes, breaking them down. Now, put those 2 words together, and what do you think of? Conversations related to the intersection of gender equality and energy has pretty much become 2 parts: the economic engagement, such as skill development and access to finance and credit, or the second part, systematic gender issues like equal access. As of 2016, women representation in the energy sector is only 35% on average in the workforce. That number plummets devastatingly to 6% when we move up to the C-suite. As a woman who came from the energy industry, I can tell you that's a disappointing reality, and it's an important conversation we should be focusing on. But what aren't we talking about? What we aren't talking about is the relationship between energy access and women empowerment. Energy poverty has the face of a woman. 1 in 5 people in Africa and South Asia don't have access to electricity, which is close to 3 billion people. That's 40% of the global population. And those that don't have the access to modern energy, they burn fuel such as wood, charcoal, animal waste. And those are used for daily cooking and heating. That means that rural women who usually are using these sources of energy for cooking and heating are women and girls. And so they are the primary energy producers for the household. Why does that matter? The way that energy is accessed and used is not neutral in its impact. Energy poverty, which means you don't have access to energy, and energy equity is disproportionately adversely affecting women and young girls. The disadvantages of the lack of energy for women includes health, education, quality of life, security, and productivity. And while these do apply to men, like I mentioned, it's disproportionate to women, which means we have more adverse effects than our male counterparts, especially in rural, poor areas. That's on top of the fact that existing power relations and institutions today, they discriminate against women in many developing countries. But it's also a two-way street. The slow transition of modern energy sources in some regions of the world is in part intertwined with the fact that there's a failure to address gender dimensions of energy poverty. So basically, we're hitting a ceiling on developing renewable sources by not addressing the gender conversation in the room. And then furthermore, historically, this is a sector, energy sector, that has not used gender perspectives to reach that impact of economic empowerment. And it needs to, because current energy programs don't have a gender lens. And like I mentioned, we're hitting that boundary of energy development. So my research has been a white paper discussing that important linkage that we don't talk enough about. There's a lot of conversations, especially in the United Nations and the World Bank, putting a focus on it, but we're just at the forefront of this discussion. So I will take any questions related to what that looks like, what is the current trajectory, and what are we still missing in the conversation. With that, I'll actually turn it over to Ellery and Nicholas to talk about RTO.
Great, thanks so much, Elizabeth. I will start the screen share.
All right, perfect. So my name is Ellie Curtis, and along with Nick Britton, I'll be discussing our research on the impact of COVID-19 on regional transmission organizations, or RTOs as they're called. And we conducted this research last spring and into the summer, starting right after the onset of the pandemic, at a time when there was incredible uncertainty within our electricity system. So it was very exciting to be a part of, and we were joined with the students at the bottom of this page and led by Dr. Elizabeth Wilson. Next slide. All right, so to begin with a bit of background, the restructuring of the electricity grid in the early 2000s led to the separation of generation and transmission. And FERC ordered the formation of voluntary RTOs to manage load, facilitate power markets, plan the grid, and work with stakeholders. And so with this background, we wanted to answer a few research questions as the COVID-19 situation evolved. So first, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted operations, communications, electricity load, and the overall power sector trends for RTOs? Second, were there similarities and differences between each of their responses? And were these dynamics due to socio-political or regional characteristics of each RTO? And then finally, did COVID-19 shift RTO priorities at all? And how have they adapted since? You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so like Ellie just mentioned, we focused on communications, operations, and load across all of these RTOs. One of the interesting things we found about communications is that they definitely differed a lot based on the governance structures of each of these RTOs. particularly the socio-political impacts that come with each. So for example, PJM, which is sort of in the DC region, was much more forward with a lot of the information they were providing about load changes and COVID protocols, whereas SPP, is sort of in the Midwest region, was a little bit less forward with their information, didn't really post anything on their public website. Concerning operations, all of the RTOs were pretty quick to respond to the pandemic, pretty much around the same time in mid-March. However, some of them did respond faster than others, particularly those that were harder hit at the very beginning of the pandemic, such as CAISO, which is in California. But something that was interesting is that they had sort of differences in reopening times later into the summer and into the fall. And this largely depended on how states were responding to the COVID pandemic, how they were reopening their economies. And that sort of brings us into load as well. There was pretty significant differences between the geography of each of these RTOs and urbanization. So we saw pretty stark differences in load changes from just New York City to upstate New York and the New York ISO. We also saw an increase in residential load and a decrease in commercial load, obviously because of the stay-at-home measures that were implemented across the states. We also saw a shift in peaks from sort of typical commuter hours, and we sort of saw them level out as well, so they weren't as steep as they had been before. And this forced a lot of the RTOs to sort of redo a lot of their projections for how they were going to assess load coming into the future. And as I mentioned, as these states sort of returned to normal operations, reopened their economies, we weren't really, something that we looked at and that we discuss in the next slide is sort of the longer term impacts of the recession. It was a little bit less certain about how that would impact these RTOs.
So many RTOs reported significant price drops since the beginning of the pandemic, some ranging from 30 to 50% lower than the year before. And this was partly a result of COVID-19, but also from milder weather and lower fuel prices. And as a result, some RTOs saw major budget deficits for this fiscal year, while others actually reported a surplus. And then in the long term, not all RTOs divulge this type of information to the public, but certain RTOs released long-term summer peak load forecasts, saying that the COVID-19 impact might be longer than expected, perhaps up to 3 to 4 years. In terms of renewable energy, RTO's planning capacities were sort of impacted in two ways. So many RTOs saw longer or record days of renewable penetrations, but also ended up having to curtail the most renewable energy that we've seen so far because the duck curve was heightened by decreased loads. And so additionally, there was also a huge number of projects deferred, especially wind power projects that had to be put on hold due to stay-at-home orders. And then RTOs also reported transmission and generation owners had to defer maintenance due to those stay-at-home orders, but they have reported that they're caught up now. And then supply chain disruptions were initially predicted to be potentially grave for the electricity system, but it didn't actually have as big of an effect as predicted. And then finally, RTOs dealt with increased cybersecurity threats as remote employees were working outside of the office and on their own VPNs, which increased the threat of malware and ransomware attacks. And this is something that's increasingly an issue for the electricity system as we see smart grids becoming a potential solution to climate change and being implemented now. So with that, it sort of shows that the COVID-19 pandemic is potentially showing frailties within the system.
Yeah, so just to summarize what we went over and sort of our research as a whole, like Ellie mentioned, like I mentioned, there was a system load decrease ranging from 4 to 10% across all of these RTOs during our study period from March to June in 2020. And like Ellie mentioned, system prices were down anywhere from 30 to 50% comparing year to year. But then in the summer, again, as I mentioned, as things started to reopen, the economy started to reopen around the country. and hotter than normal temperatures sort of brought that load back up to what all of these RTOs were expecting. Concerning lasting impacts, one of the main things is how these RTOs operate, particularly on the ground, whether or not they'll have to be in the office anymore, dealing with cybersecurity, like Ellie mentioned, and a lot of those additional trends and impacts that that these RTOs are sort of dealing with. It also particularly highlighted the need for greater grid flexibility and adaptability to unpredictable load changes. So this was something that was pretty concerning as COVID hit for all of these RTOs. And we've seen both Ellie and I with our work sort of following this with Dr. Wilson on climate change and COVID RTO flexibility. That's stuff that we've seen sort of in Texas as well with the recent power outages. It sort of just highlights a lot of these failures in the grid so far. Then lastly, sort of accelerating these existing trends, like Ellie mentioned, sort of how renewables are increasing across the country, but this reduced load as a result of COVID led to increased curtailment. So it sort of points to this need for better real-time energy monitoring and metering systems, excuse me. So with that, thank you all for listening, and we will turn it over to Robert.
Hi, I'll go and get my screen projected now. All right, well, hi everyone. My name is Robert Sewell, and I am a second-year MBA student at Tuck. I am also the CEO of Vesper Solar. We are transforming the last mile of solar installation, and where we are starting is solar panel attachment. Today, solar panels are attached using conventional fasteners like bolts, bolted clamps, and rivets. These conventional fasteners create massive problems. First, they are not secure. These fasteners have been pinpointed as a primary cause of catastrophic system failure in severe weather. Second, these fasteners are extremely expensive to install. It's a slow, mistake-prone process that requires significant ongoing maintenance. I've met with over 100 solar installers, and every single person has agreed that this process is broken. And now the top names in solar are all talking about it. NREL, Nextracker, Rocky Mountain Institute, all of these companies have published papers saying that this solar panel attachment is a serious problem that we need to solve now for the industry. In my company, Vesper Solar, we think we solved it with the Vesper Solar V-clamp system. It's a low-cost, extremely fast solar panel attachment method that increases the strength of solar arrays. We are a two-time winner of the DOE and NREL's American-made solar competition. And here it is. It is about as simple as it could be. You can see it right here on the left. So I'll tell you why we think we have solved this problem. First, it's more secure. We've eliminated a lot of the common failure modes that are associated with conventional fasteners, primarily because our product does not rely on torque. Second, our V-clamp is 4 times faster to install than conventional fasteners. Each panel takes less than 30 seconds. For a large scale utility scale project, we can cut up to a month in installation time. It's an extremely low cost solution and is universal. It works with all modules, all utility scale racking systems. There's really nothing like this in the market today. Our product's been tested and validated by some of the top experts in solar at Sandia National Labs. Our innovation in our business case has been validated by NREL and the DOE as part of the American-made solar competition. And we're backed today by some great group of investors from Launchpad Venture Group and the Dartmouth Angels. So I'll show you how it works here in 4 seconds. So that was so quick, you might have missed it. I'll show it to you again. All you do is you squeeze it, you insert it, and it locks right into place. It's about as simple as it could be. And what we've done is we've made installing a solar panel as easy as changing a light bulb. This is my co-founder here as well. He's a professor at the University of Oklahoma. He spent the last decade designing solutions that makes solar faster, cheaper, and easier to install. We have 3 large-scale projects scheduled for this summer. 2 are in the US and 1's in Europe. We're currently working with some of the largest companies in solar hardware today to deploy our technology globally. With our IP, we see an opportunity to drive an outsized impact in the solar industry. We're starting by transforming the PV installation space. We're reducing the cost structure of utility scale solar, and we're making arrays stronger and more secure. But beyond attachment, we believe that we have the opportunity to enable entirely new business models on top of our IP. That's because the V-clamp is a module agnostic attachment solution. It works with any module and today, solar arrays are customized to fit the specific module that's being used on a project. It's a basic challenge. You have to align the mounting holes in the module with the mounting holes in the steel structure that sits underneath it. And as you can see in this picture, there's a ton of variability between the location of mounting holes across solar panels. The best analogy I have for this is it's kind of like having to customize a lamp to fit a specific light bulb. The V-clamp, like I said before, is a universal attachment solution. We've eliminated this complexity. We work with any panel, any type of steel racking, solar racking system. And our product's going to do what the light bulb socket did for lighting. We've eliminated the need to customize hardware to fit a specific system. So what do we think this is going to enable? The first is the low-cost repowering of existing arrays. With the V-clamp, we can come in and replace existing modules on an array with newer, more efficient modules. You can do this without making it be a big construction project. It's as easy as changing a light bulb, and you can increase the output of your solar farm significantly by taking advantage of some of these really advancements we've seen in PV over the past few years. After you've redeployed this module or repowered these arrays, we also see a big opportunity to redeploy the used equipment in emerging markets. So you repower the array and then you take those used modules and you bring them to emerging markets. And as PV technology continues to improve year after year, we really believe that the V-clamp can be the critical enabling technology for creating distributed, resilient grid infrastructure in emerging markets using with used PV equipment. So to conclude, I guess we've identified and solved for a really big problem in solar today, but we see our technology being transformative, not just in the cost structure for solar, but also in enabling entirely new business models. So thank you very much for your time. I've had a blast working on this at Dartmouth with all the advisors at Tuck and across the Dartmouth ecosystem. So happy to talk about it. Now I'll pass it off to Samlefkowski.
Thanks, Robert. Hi, everybody. My name is Samlefkowski. I am a student at Dartmouth, class of 2021. I'm an engineering major, and I'm also a student researcher with the Irving Institute. And today I'll be talking about a project that I did this December between the fall and winter terms. And I was looking at the cafeteria that's going up in the new Irving building, which is my virtual background today, as well as the background on the slides that you're viewing. The cafeteria going in the building is really exciting. It's going to serve food to students and faculty over at the Thayer School of Engineering and the Tuck School of Business and the computer science building that's being built, as well as the Irving Institute building. But I was actually looking at the cafeteria from an energy perspective, doing techno-economic analysis to find a way to conserve energy and save money with the equipment that we were planning on buying. So I got involved in this project in the late fall after I'd taken some energy classes with my engineering major. I met with Stephen Doig, who's the head of research with Irving, and he told me about sort of a problem that had arose. The Irving building has, from the beginning, had a really ambitious energy goal of being less than 20 kBTUs per square foot per day, which is really ambitious and an impressively low amount of energy to use on a daily basis. And the design team from Goody Clancy, they looked across the entire building systems, including the solar PV system on the roof, natural ventilation, a high efficiency HVAC system, all these different parts to reach that goal. But the cafeteria, the equipment in the cafeteria, which is being purchased by Dartmouth Dining Services, was sort of a separate consideration. And so that's why it wasn't until really late fall of this year that Stephen realized, oh, this could be a huge energy consumer and we need to take a look at this. And the first thing I did was just modeling the energy use for the cafeteria. I looked at all the equipment we were planning on buying, figured out how much energy it uses on a daily basis, summed it up, and looked at that per the square footage of the cafeteria and found that in terms of energy intensity, the energy per square foot, the cafeteria is actually using 500 kBTUs per square foot per day, which is 25 times more energy than the spec had, than the design goal had outlined. And so that was pretty concerning. And it was late in the game too. So I jumped in and I was like, what can we do at this point to reduce energy and save money? So looking deeper into those energy consumers in the cafeteria, I realized that 5 really components of the appliances and equipment use 83% of the total energy in the cafeteria. That's the merchandise cases, the ice machines, the espresso machine and the coffee machine, and then the rapid food cookers. And so we realized, if we don't have to look at every single appliance or piece of equipment, if we just look at the 5 biggest consumers, that's most of the problem. And so that was sort of the first way of modeling the energy use and thinking about possible alternatives. So just one example of an alternative that we made. So the merchandise cases, as I mentioned, that's one of the biggest consumers. It's actually the largest together. That was 25% of the energy used in the cafeteria between these 2 merchandise cases. And they're basically just fancy refrigerators. There's baked goods on the left, stored in a cooled environment. And then on the right, baked goods, as well as some beverages. And the merchandise case on the right, which uses 19 kilowatt hours every day, was a bit of a problem because there's this open air section where it's cooling the beverages, but there's no insulation. It's just open to the environment. So it's constantly trying to keep that area cold to keep those beverages cool. But then the cold air is just escaping into the atmosphere and it's not containing any of it. And that's why it's using so much energy every day. And so making an alternative swap here, you can see we kept the baked goods merchandise case on the left, but then we swapped out and installed this refrigerator instead. And this refrigerator, maybe it's a little bit less aesthetically pleasing, maybe a little bit less convenient because you have to open the doors of the refrigerator to get your beverage and close it after you're done. But just that swap saves thousands of dollars in upfront costs in buying the appliance. And it also saves 15 kilowatt hours every day, which has a pretty significant financial and environmental saving over 5 to 10 years. And so if we sum up basically all of the savings by doing the same thing with the merchandise cases to a bunch of different equipment and appliances, I realized that there's $10,000 or more in capital costs upfront that you could save with different equipment, and $6,000 in energy costs over 5 years without changing any of the capabilities of the cafeteria, still serving all the same food, still pretty much just as convenient for people who are coming in. But that's 30 kilowatt hours every day that you're not going to be using. And just to put that into perspective for people who don't know about, what kilowatt hours equate to, we talked a lot about bikers, and a pro cycler can generate 200 watts when they're biking, which is for every hour 200 watt hours. And so for a pro biker to work hard enough to make up this 30 kilowatt hour difference, they would have to bike for 150 hours nonstop at that really ambitious pace, 200 watts, just to make up 1 day's worth of the energy that we're saving by doing these like for like swaps. And some other lessons that I learned from this project were some things don't have good alternatives. Coffee and espresso machines, for example, are one. They're always hot. They're not really energy efficient alternatives on the market, and people need their coffee. So it's one of those things where there's not a great alternative. But then looking at other things like refrigerators and freezers and rapid cookers, there's so many alternatives on the market today where you can swap out and save money and save the environment in doing that. And there's just opportunities in cafeterias at Dartmouth beyond the urban cafeteria, opportunities in building in general. And so this project got me really passionate about that. And hopefully, as I start my career, I'll have the opportunity to work on more projects in green building. So thanks to the Irving Institute for the opportunity, and thanks for putting together the conference so I could talk about it. And I'll pass it off to Katie next to finish up.
Awesome, thanks, Sam. Anytime that I can join a panel where we're talking about espresso machines and duck curves all in the same hour is it's a good hour to be. I love the diversity here of everything that you guys have been studying and digging into in all of the different projects. I have lots of questions, but just a reminder that if you have questions either on specific projects or just for all of the students, please just go ahead and type those in. And again, we'll get to as many as we can. I'm going to start with a question that a couple of different people can answer, or as many as you want. But I feel like a common theme here is that a lot of you in your experiences were looking at one question or one issue, but whether it was a tiny house or whether it was, gender and energy equity issues around the globe, what you're seeing are these really systematic problems that you can't just solve with one little solution. And so would anybody like to talk about just how interconnected the energy systems that they were looking at and the work that they did change their perspective of other things that they were studying moving forward, or what other interests it brought up that maybe they didn't have before starting this particular project? Jack or Pierce, maybe from your trips, it would be interesting to hear, how seeing a lot of different experiences down in the Gulf, changed your perspective once you got back to Dartmouth.
Yeah, I can definitely start. And just by saying that, I mean, the vast regional differences across this country in terms of the energy systems, it was just so on show in Texas and Louisiana, coming from Dartmouth, where we have a very kind of unified energy system, but there's also so much optimism around campus and in this community about this new energy frontier that we're encountering. But what it's going to take is a nationwide effort and nationwide spearheaded policy changes, but also innovation. And it's going to take adaptability in different regions. And so, you talk to people in Texas who are concerned about their livelihoods if oil and gas starts to fade out. But then you also talk to people in the city of Houston who are optimistic about these new renewable frontiers that are coming about. And then you go to Louisiana and you see the effects of these past energy systems and what that can bring. I think sometimes it can be a trap to get into a mindset where you think that one size fits all because of the region and the environment that we are in. And so I think it takes going to these different regions and actually talking to the people behind these energy systems, communicating with them, finding out their wants and needs to make this a more cohesive effort to reach that new energy frontier.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah,
jump in there.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking similarly, just thinking about how uneven the impacts of the energy system have been, in previous generations and even like in our generation going forward, and how we need to think about correcting and remedying those inequities, as we like develop a new energy system or like transition into new things, I guess. One part of the trip that was really interesting was we went to work with this local Louisiana artist named Hannah Chalou, who kind of makes recycled art out of like recycled and reclaimed objects from like the trash in Louisiana in New Orleans, and just talking about like how much trash accumulates in her community and how like it affects things like health and stuff like that. And I think the art, so what we did with her is that we made paper out of old paper, but we kept pieces of like trash and plastic in the paper and stuff, and we got to take it home. And yeah, so just thinking about like I think like in Louisiana, especially like thinking about hurricanes and all these things that like disproportionately affected Black communities and like the Vietnamese communities that we saw, and then also like the indigenous communities. So I think that's something that the trip really illuminated for me.
Yeah, great, thank you. The sun just came out in my office here, I think. Elizabeth, I have a question for you. What did you, you were at PG&E at one point, and did you do any comparisons between really large companies, whether it be like a PG&E or like sort of a Shell, who's obviously trying to very much move into the off-grid space with some of the investments that they made there, and then more kind of startup and privately held off-grid companies, or just other startups in the space, and whether they're thinking differently about representation for women in particular, or just even how they're building their teams compared to legacy energy companies. Did you have space to look at that in your work?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When I was at PG&E, since I was a chief of staff role, we did do a lot of diversity hiring lookings, and also I was involved as the head of the employee network there for women and also for Asians. And I will tell you that I actually saw the numbers for smaller startups, unless you're specifically focused like a fund for women entrepreneurs in energy. There's actually even worse numbers. So when I quoted around 30% of women in the workforce, that's for a big company. When you go to smaller startups, when you go to smaller like boots on the ground, which is really great development, the numbers is actually even worse. So I feel what I've been trying to study, especially in rural areas, so not so much on the hiring front, that there needs to be a systemic policy. There needs to be a lens and frameworks that we use so that we don't forget about that percentage. We don't forget about, to Pierce's and Jack's point earlier, the different communities that are affected differently, because no one size fits all. But those are the observations and the numbers that we were tracking. So it's interesting. You would think that a smaller company that has a lot more control, the numbers would be better. I think it's actually, with all the different things you're trying to do running a company, it comes sadly last.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I mean disappointing, but there's also a lot of disappointing things across the energy sector that I think everybody here on this panel will hopefully focus on moving forward. Robert, I don't want to go down a geeky rabbit hole with you because we have less than 10 minutes here, but could you just talk a little bit whether in the near term you're focused more on the repowering opportunity rather than new build for this technology, and maybe I don't know if you probably have some scope on the potential size of the repowering market, but maybe for some people who are listening and on the panel, just talk a little bit about that, because I think that we hear about wind repowering, right, much more than solar repowering at the moment, but that's going to be changing certainly in the years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and I think about my company's focus right now, we're a small startup, and there's a lot of areas we can tackle and would like to tackle, but what we are focused on right now is the new build market. It's making panel attachment faster, cheaper, and more reliable, because the IP is there. The other repowering is a huge opportunity, but it requires different funding, different capital structure, and a lot of capabilities that we don't have in-house right now. It'll be partnering with EPCs with a financing source. So it's the gold North Star where we're moving towards as a company.
Okay.
But right now we're focused on really the upfront installation and new build. As far as the size of the opportunity, I think you're right. There hasn't been much happening yet in solar. There's some big projects in the US in the 50 to 60 megawatt range that are, just hearing rumblings about people looking into it now and realizing, man, this thing's going to be a nightmare to actually on the construction side. But I've seen some interesting stats for Europe, where Europe will actually probably be leading the charge, specifically Germany, just because.
Yeah, right. Because they were early on. Yeah.
There's something like 30 to 40 gigawatts of potential repowering opportunities across Europe. So it's massive opportunity, but it hasn't. We're a few years from it really taking off now. When there's a lot to geek out on the engineering side. There's also a lot of tax incentives. So on the financial modeling side as well, that we could get down in a rabbit hole, but I'll stay up. But big opportunity that hadn't really hit yet.
Yeah, the financing piece of repowering is a whole other ball of wax. That's like its own half-day conference. I know from some sessions at Ref Wall Street. So since I mentioned the duck curve, Ellie and Nicholas, I want to return to some of the renewable curtailments that you were seeing across RTOs. Obviously, a real issue look different in different parts of the globe as well, right? Certainly not unique just to the RTOs here in the US. Did you have a chance to dig into, how maybe some of the different approaches the RTOs were taking for dealing with that, and whether there was any sort of innovation to minimize curtailment that hadn't been happening before the very stark power change needs of COVID?
I can take this. So I didn't find any other mention besides curtailment. So I think like throughout this whole sort of crisis the RTOs were dealing with, they were very focused on reliability and not so much how much renewables they can integrate into the grid. So that I'm not thinking they had time to really sort of implement innovative approaches for renewable integration within their grid. So really, we just saw curtailment, especially in CAISO. And I mean, I could be wrong, and I'm sure they are sort of continually addressing that question. But throughout our research, as pertaining to COVID-19, we didn't see any mention of like yeah, to your question, no.
All right. You want to add anything there, Nicholas?
Yeah, I was just going to add a quick point, sort of about like that more generally and how that impacts sort of grid adaptability. I think that was something that we definitely saw with COVID, and it was something that I mentioned briefly in the presentation, that it sort of has pretty drastic impacts on people, and people don't really recognize it, because I wouldn't say that the common person necessarily knows what an RTO is. Like when I talk to my family about what RTOs are, they really have no idea what I'm researching. But as we saw with Texas over the winter, and with our research on COVID-19, it can have a pretty significant impact on people's daily lives, whether or not they can actually have electricity to heat their homes and continue to work, whether they're working at home or they have to go into work. So it definitely, especially with renewables and trying to figure out how they will or will not be curtailing them, I think it's pretty interesting to see how there's a lot of gaps in how these grids function right now, and it definitely points towards a lot of ways that they could be improved.
Yeah, absolutely. During the terrible crisis in Texas, I had the unique opportunity to explain capacity markets to a lot of people who would have never wanted to know what a capacity market was before that. So for better or for worse. So that is absolutely true. I think there's time for one more question. And I have a question. When you were designing this tiny house, you talked about speaking with the researchers and the folks who would be using this space. And I don't know how early on in the design process that was, but I was wondering if that changed anything in terms of the design, that you had to sort of go back to the drawing board, either from the energy footprint of this little house, or just the interior space and how it'd be used, and sort of balancing all of the needs while making sure that it would be exactly what people would want to use it for.
Yeah, good question. Balancing all of those things was definitely the hardest part of that project and the design process. We went through a couple different phases of energy system design. Originally, unfortunately, so heat pumps are like state of the art. Everyone loves heat pumps. But
True.
unfortunately, the house was too small for a heat pump to actually make sense. So it would just put too much strain on the generation that the PV system was able to produce. And so we were kind of tossing around maybe a wood stove it would require very small amounts of wood, but like not quite zero emissions. Went with that idea for a little bit because we thought it's a weird use in the winter where it's not going to be used every day, and so it just has to heat up pretty quickly and be used for a few hours every day, and then can kind of cool down again. But we were able to actually switch to by providing enough insulation from the outset, so the walls are about 12 inches thick. 8 inches thick. We had to sort of negotiate on the space with that one, but it's super insulated, and so we were able to actually provide enough heat, we think, with just 3 very small personal 200 watt electric heaters, like personal electric heaters for the entire house. So yeah, I'll be very interested to see how that works out once we've got it. Supposedly it should really like heat this thing up really quickly. and keep it heated. But yeah, I'm excited to see how that goes. The idea is that they can always add more if they need a little extra heat. So
You can always just put on a hat if it's a little cold, right? Like I grew up in New England, like you can always just put on a hat indoors. So yeah, I have to say my final thought, because I know that it's time to wrap up here, is Sam, I think that you've really launched yourself onto a probably $1 trillion idea for a commercial grade, super efficient espresso machine. That if you could, that if you teamed up with the right people, Starbucks might come calling. So you might want to think about that for your next project, because it sounds like there's a need for some of that. I want to thank everybody on this panel for your presentations, for your time, for sharing the work that you're doing. Hopefully beyond these specific projects, it's getting you all to just think about the many ways there are to interact with not only the larger energy industry, but energy is everywhere, right? It's in a tiny house that can be moved around, and it's in our natural environment in the way that our energy systems are affecting those. And it seems like all the work that you guys have done are seeing that there's just so many ways to solve these problems and tackle them. And I think that is awesome. So yeah, just thanks again. And thanks to everybody listening in. You can certainly click around at the Irving Institute and see some of the other work that's happening and that they are funding across the Dartmouth campus. So thank you to everybody and have a great afternoon.
thank you.
Thank you.